Hello, everyone. Give everybody just a few minutes to pop in, and then we'll get started the way we usually do. Happy Tuesday, and welcome back to the joy of game mastering. My name's Alex Thomas, and I will be your joyful game master today. Wait for a couple folks to jump in here, and then we'll really get started. But hope everything is well out there. Hey, Paul, good morning. How you doing today? All right, I'm here. It's 1 after, so people will start filtering in. I'll probably have to repeat myself a couple of times for the people who are here at the top of the hour, but happy Tuesday and welcome to the Joy of Game Mastering. I'm your host, Alex Thomas, trying to make the world a better place for game masters all over. I'm the line developer for Mutants and Masterminds here at Green Onion Publishing, and I have been a game master for the last 20 years, give or take. So, do it all the time, love it, live it, it's great. And we need more game masters out here doing the hard work. So, I'm here to help answer questions, here to help guide you through it. Pretty groovy. Took me a little while to get in, so that might be the source of the delay. Well, I don't think you have a delay. I think there's just a natural delay between me speaking and the internet making it available to y'all. But today's topic, we are talking all about problem powers. So how to accommodate characters who have amazing, wondrous abilities that might make it difficult to challenge them or difficult to write a compelling story around. Now, already I have framed this incorrectly to you. No powers are a problem. Some of them just need a little bit more of a deft touch compared to others to include in your story. And thinking of these powers as a problem is not really the mindset you want to go into solving this problem with. One of the key things about role-playing games is that characters eventually become powerful and get to do fun and exciting, amazing things, depending on the game that you're running. I mean, if your characters become super powerful in a Call of Cthulhu game, it's very likely something has gone wrong. But, and things are going to, devolve into some kind of madness-induced violent rage very quickly. But for things like Dungeons and Dragons or Mutants and Masterminds, the goal of the game is for those heroes to have amazing abilities and get to use them. So first, the thing you want to frame is the idea of problem powers. Think of them more as interesting obstacles to overcome than a true problem. The players who take those kinds of abilities, they really like the opportunity to sort of mess with your perception of the story, mess with how things are going, and I think there's plenty of room for GMs to have compelling stories and players to get to use the amazing abilities they have in mind. Hey, Devious. Hey, Warden Maximus. How's everybody doing today? Happy Tuesday. We're going for a jog on the Joy of Game Mastering. Yeah. So, what kind of powers can be problematic? These are things like super speed, which we're going to go way into more depth next week on Mutants and Masterminds Monday with our episode dealing with speedsters. But it is important to keep in mind that at a certain point, characters are able to start moving and reacting fast enough that it can become an issue when trying to design interesting and compelling combat encounters. Powers like precognition or postcognition, especially in the event of you writing a lot of mysteries, it can be difficult to prepare for people to be like, well, I can see perfectly what happened in this room, so tell me what happened. And that solves the whole mystery. Or things like speak with dead, or lots of different kinds of powers. Hey, Squire, good to see you. Squire brings up teleportation attacks. Teleportation in general can be difficult to accommodate because it can eliminate some of the movement and all that fun stuff. Dimensional banishment, mind control, even things like super strength can be an issue. Things like phasing or even flight for some games can lead to a power difference that's hard to accommodate for. So, what are some of your problem powers that you've run into? Yes, telepathy, the great ruiner of mysteries, especially if it's known to be perfectly accurate telepathy, or a chaos spell to put on a player, to put on an enemy, to say, tell me what you know about this, and then they have to be 100% truthful. Even zone of truth can be a difficult thing to overcome. GM Jonesy says, did somebody say problem powers? Like Jonesy doesn't know he's the problem power in my game right now with doesn't have a soul. I'll bring everybody back to life. I'm going into the underworld and we're going to have a conversation about this dead NPC, or phasing through walls, or I'm insubstantial, you can't hurt me. Just pretty much all the fun ghost powers that Jonesy plays with in our regular game at Freedom Week Dark. So, yeah, I have some experience with characters who have wondrous abilities that can be tough. Oh, Jonesy, you're not the problem. Derek is the problem. Born Maximus unchecked variable, gravity and inertia powers. Yeah. Lots of fun things to try and wrap your head around and try to accommodate for. And Paul mentions, for mine, the problem isn't necessarily the powers, but the players. That can definitely be an issue when you run into players who are looking at the rule system as an opportunity to come up with some sort of weird exploit that it creates a weird physics engine for the game. Like the peasant railgun, where technically everybody can use a free action to shift a spear from one person to the next. So if you did that for like 10 miles, what happens when it hits the thing at the end of the line? Yeah. And I think the new DM's guide over at D&D Land does a good job of mentioning that the rules are not intended to create a physics engine. They're intended to facilitate a good, fun time with your friends, which is a great line that I've integrated into my own ideas behind rule design. Paul says there's a lot of it is learned behaviors, where the approach to strategic solving of problems in an adversarial relationship with the GM. Yeah, that's where a lot of the problem stems from, is the idea that the GM is out to get me, and I have to do everything in my power to sort of abuse some mechanic in the game to find a loophole to become the most powerful of all. That's not our goal. Our goal today is to we'll talk about that player for a second. Because like Paul says, problem powers tend to pop up when you have players who think the goal of role-playing is to eliminate any challenges or difficulties as quickly as possible. Yeah. And this goes back to what we were talking about yesterday on M&M Monday, with managing genre expectations and having that conversation with your players before we get started, to be like, hey, I want to tell a fun story. Here are some of the tropes that we'll be dealing with. You know, I'm not out to get you. As the game master, if I was out to get you, you'd be dead. Is sort of just general good GM talk. Like, oh, I don't need to use the rules of the game to kill your character. Your character has a heart attack, he's dead. End of story. Like, or rocks fall, everybody dies. The goal is to appear to be adversarial and appear to be challenging them, but it's never the goal. It's never your goal to win. It shouldn't be anyway. It's just an older philosophy for game mastering. So, how do we accommodate these things? You know, how do we ask these players, you know, what is it about this power set that appeals to you? What are you trying to accomplish? Because you do want to be able to get to the root of the storytelling thing that they're trying to get across. You know, one of the cool things, and Jonesy, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the cool things about Mortis, in my opinion, is that Mortis has this spooky power skill set and has dealt with this sort of the weight of all of this power, but is trying to step away from that dark reputation and is trying to become, you know, known as a more upbeat hero. And I think he's accomplished that in a lot of ways in our game. So for Jonesy, in my mind, it was never about. For Jonesy, it was never about being the most powerful member of the team. It was, this is a cool theme that I'm interested in. You know, how can we come up with ways to incorporate it? And Jonesy's been great working with me to, as a player and a GM, coming up with, okay, these are the kinds of situations that I want to excel at. These are the kinds of villains that I want to run into. And He's been very cool when I introduced a challenge specifically meant to sort of check his abilities. Because what you want to do as GM is you want to present a challenge that can be a counter to those unique powers without completely shutting them down. So, and not, never focus on one player at a time with those things. One adventure in a while, you should have something come up where they have to deal with this problem. For instance, Mortis isn't able to phase into a certain location. Warren Maximus, why are you coming at me like that? And to reward him, I took his eye. Yeah. Simon says, I can think of a few ways to cheaply counter various powers. Foam fire extinguishers or paint to mess with invisible opponents is a good example. Yeah. And incorporating challenges like that, the player who takes those powers, they want to be challenged. Their concept calls for it in a lot of ways. So, especially invisible characters, sometimes let them shine, let them do the cool, overpowered thing, but then occasionally hit them with a counter, hit them with a check on that ability. Because it's never exciting for them either if they just succeed all the time. So, lots of good stuff. We talked about telepathy and precognition and postcognition. My favorite tools for interfering with those abilities are unreliable narrator. So, either the power is inconsistent, it has some big, cost to it to make it happen, or it's just the information you receive is from a biased source. So lots of good stuff. Jonesy, I appreciate that. He says, I give Alex lots of grief for the eye, but it was a cool story moment. It was a cool story moment. And eye patches are cool. And getting to see Mortis go a little bit even darker was it's been a fun dynamic to play with. I'm really excited to see what happens when we get back to things after the first of the year. Dr. Boyd, good to see you. I missed yesterday because of a chaotic weekend and a decompress while building an NPC. I almost had a player make a character take insubstantial as permanent, but ultimately went a different way. Yeah, insubstantial as permanent is an interesting challenge to overcome. And some of that comes to compromise. So if the character can always phase through things, how are they able to interact with the material world? You have to say, if you want that ability, what is the trade-off for that? How can I, can you only do it? It's permanent. So can you only interact with the material world occasionally? Are there limitations to what you can interfere with? Is there a specific kind of energy that always affects you? Finding some kind of catch to that ability. And just telling the player, hey, I know that's a really cool power. You're not going to have as good a time if you are awesome at everything, and everybody else is not going to have as good a time. So, yeah. Paul says, is that going to be fun for you to play in the long term? Yep, that is a wonderful question to ask every player when they're coming up with a character concept. Because you do find some players who, they come to role-playing games because they like tinkering with the mechanics, or they like trying to find a power set that seems to be, seems broken. It's a challenge for them trying to solve. And you don't want to necessarily discourage them doing that. But you do want them to be, you want them to have the ability to do so if they want. Doc says he went in a different direction, I think in part because I'm a newbie GM. Well, that was nice of him. Yeah, and players, if you're watching this, please be accommodating to your game masters. They work really hard, and it can spook us as well. Having those kinds of abilities can result in the GM swinging too hard the other direction and making things impossible for everybody who doesn't have those amazing abilities. So that's something to look out for when you're designing adventures around these sort of problem powers. Asking players to cut you a break if you're a new GM should always be on the table. Yep. And I am not I always say never apologize before a performance, but setting expectations in a confident manner is a good move. So saying, hey, I have a great story in mind. I've not run this game system before, so can we not include these abilities? And Mutants and Masterminds is great for that. We include several warnings about particular powers. in the rulebook itself, so you can point to something, so you're not just coming at it as, I'm the GM, this is my problem. Devious mentions bathroom mentalists are an issue, of course. Yeah, so the guy in the chair, the character who's not present, so they don't have any physical stakes in anything. But they're sort of just a CCTV camera with legs. Yeah. So having to come up with ways to challenge them. And some games, it can be cool to have a character who is just back at HQ doing the thing. But you need to make sure that the player doing that is interested in that and the other players are comfortable with that. And getting to the root of, why is that the way you want to play? Are you worried that I'm going to try to kill you every session? In which case, don't worry about that. This is a narrative action game. This is an action adventure game. I'm not trying, that's not a Souls game. I'm not trying to grind you into the dust over and over and over again. And then you get the fun episodes where if there is a bathroom mentalist, what happens if somebody gets to them in the bathroom and the other heroes are far away and can't get back right away? So there is fun story meat there. Just make sure the player knows that, if you're away from the action, there will be things that you can't do. And you need to discourage them from sort of being that omnipresent player character, where you're talking to one group of players and then this other player chimes in even though their character isn't there. Or, I'm going to try to pickpocket that. Well, no, your character's not in the room right now, so I don't know how you're going to do that without, maybe you have a drone with arms or something, but that's a lot more noticeable than a sneaky little human. Yeah, I'm glad your group's been understanding, Doc Void. Squire brings up teleport attacks. One of the ways I got around the teleport attack was saying, you're sending these villains to the police without warning them. Yeah, that is a terrible surprise. Yeah, and teleportation is another good power that comes with a lot of limitations. That can come with a lot of limitations to make it fun to engage with. For instance, you have to know where you're going, or you have to have seen where you're going, or you have to actually physically see where you're going, and you can only teleport within line of sight. There's lots of ways to make that engaging. Doc Void says, one of my players is playing an 88-year-old super genius who has an disassemble power, which has been great, and I mean that. That's awesome. Is that built with variable, Doc Void? Because this is a line of... So, we've talked about narrative problem powers. We've talked about player problem powers. This is sort of a rule system problem power. Things like variable or transform or summon. Things that we include a warning for in the Mutants and Masterminds handbook because they can really interfere with the flow of the game. So, if you have variable... I don't let anybody have variable who I don't know is good at the point buy system for M&M. Other than occasionally I'll have a character like Beast Boy or Animal Man or Vixen or something who has a range of different animal powers that they can take. But I take that on myself to pre-build all of those powers and have a different sheet for each of the forms so they don't have to think about it at the table. That's for things like one-shots at conventions and things like that. But anything that can interfere with the flow of play and mess with pacing is hard to deal with. So summon is that way because you summon a bunch of additional stat blocks and initiative counts into combat. And all of a sudden, what was like 10 people acting is now 20 people acting, and everybody else is waiting longer to take their turn, while one person takes a bunch of turns. Or I have variable, I have shapeshift. I need to move all my power points around and figure out what I'm doing, which can really grind things to a halt waiting for that person to be ready. So my top tips, make sure that they know the game system really well if they're going to take those kinds of powers, and tell them to have pre-built options that they default to and have a library of, so that they can just say, I'm using this power, instead of having to build the power each time. Now, I've done characters with the variable ability because it is handy, it is cool, it is reminiscent of how certain characters act. Actually, I've got him over here. This is Dr. Henry Barrister, who has the variable power because he's a little gadgeteer and he makes gadgets. And he's life-sized. This is how big Henry is. And when he gets mad, he turns into Eddie Bear, which is a big terrible 1-inch taller Hulk teddy bear. Simon says, I've thought of an affordable way to counter winged heroes. Net guns that fire weighted nets. Just ask anyone who's flown a quadcopter drone. Yeah. And having those abilities, you know, M&M pre-builds winged as a flaw to make the power cheaper, because if the wings are bound, they can't fly. Tempo says, what about villains using those same powers? That is tough. It's not as hard when it comes to the villains as opposed to the heroes, because you're introducing, and you're the one in control of how challenging that's going to be. And theoretically, a villain who's a super genius or has mind reading or is able to phase through walls and stuff, as the GM, you're technically omnipotent anyway, so it's a little easier to roleplay that with them. And again, having a game that has a mechanic like hero points, where you can pass them out if things get too challenging, is great. You can hand that out and you're good to go. But again, it comes down to, why am I interested in presenting this challenge? And are there ways to get around it? So coming up with creative ways of overcoming the obstacle is as important as introducing a villain who has those problem powers. Yeah, Henry is one of my favorite characters I've ever played. He's such a good little bear. Although most of the other player characters have this theory that actually Henry is the evil bear and Eddie is the good one. Just because Eddie is rude but Henry is polite doesn't mean he's good. Doc Void, I went over it with him as he built it. He put a very specific set of limitations on it that only affects machines, and he has to see the target. And yes, he did pre-build his list of variables. Good. Yeah. He was the GM in our previous campaign. You find that a lot of GMs love these kinds of powers, especially if they don't get to play the game that they run very often. So it's sort of, for me, whenever I play a character who has variable, it's because I don't get to play M&M that often, and I want a chance to sort of sample everything. Yeah, it is Jekyll and Hyde, and Henry Barrister and Eddie Bear. But don't call Eddie Edward. He hates that. Oh, one second. I've got Eddie over here. I'll go grab him real quick. Don't he just at me next time? Oh. This is Eddie. I love his little drawn-on eyebrows. That's how you know he's the angry one. Yeah, they're the only player characters I've got life-size avatars for. But they're an example of a problem personality for a character to have, which I don't know that we need to get into with this topic, but that can be an extension of problem powers, is a player who has an attitude that is leading to the problem. Yeah, he's my little guy. I love him. His little scowl. He's an inch taller than Henry, which is how you know he's the super strong one. My goal when we set out to play this campaign was to not turn into Eddie for as long as possible, but then one of my teammates set me on fire in the first scene, so it happened immediately. But that's okay. That's what I'm adding. I'm adding Calvin. Yeah, but what other powers are problematic for y'all as players, GMs out there? And that is... Oh, good. Calvin's here. Yeah, you think about that, Speed Demon. Wow, amazing. And some of it does come down to, what is this game about? Is this game meant to include characters who have amazing abilities? That's one of the daunting things for people who, when they move from low-level D&D to higher-level D&D, is now how do I challenge my players because they have all of these amazing abilities, and it can be really daunting. Playing something like M&M, you sort of start out the gate with the players that powerful, so it's built into your expectations when you're writing the game of this is a superhero game. They're going to have lots of abilities that are harder to interact with. But you sort of have a framing device for that when you sit down to run M&M, where other games, it can be scary. So don't feel like, the instinct to prevent players from using these powers makes sense. But I urge you to try not to succumb to it because it can lead to really memorable stories. And it can lead to really interesting, creativity and really interesting, trials for them to overcome and for you to overcome. It becomes sort of a puzzle for both of you. And again, it involves having good players, like most good GM advice. I hate to say it, but I think having good players is probably 80% of being a good GM. Yeah, Pohl mentions the Swiss Army knife array can be irksome. In Mutants and Masterminds, people who are like a sorcerer who can make every effect happen, or a battle suit who has a piece of technology for every situation, or Bowman with all of his different trick arrows. That can be hard because it steps on the toes of other players. You want everybody to have something they're good at so that they have built-in places to shine. Dr. Boy says, I don't know that this exactly qualifies, but I have another character who has a motorbike with a summonable power, and I wasn't sure if she also needed the summon vehicle power or not. No, she doesn't need the summon vehicle power to go along with that. Yeah, and if it became a problem with points, I also wouldn't worry too much about making it have the summonable power. It could just be a cool thing that never let rules get in the way of a good story. Yep, Dr. Wood said, I said heck with it because it's a cool bike. It does break the game. Yep. Rebel Moose says, I find encouraging creativity can be a good way to reduce problem powers. I had a player want to build a speedster, but after talking about other media, he changed to a psychic martial artist. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And again, it comes to directing the player. Why are you interested in this? What about this fantasy appeals to you? And is there another way we can do that? Summon is a power that I have lots of fun ways to get around. Because ultimately, what they want to do with the summon is either, make it harder for them to get hurt, do more attacks per round, or attack a wider area, or create some other kind of effect. And you can boil that down to just a power on the regular character. I've got Necromancer characters who, instead of summoning 20 skeleton minions, I'll just have them do a burst area damage effect to simulate the skeletons attacking everybody. And then they're they can be a deflect power, so that represents the skeletons jumping in the way of attacks. Or they could be additional protection for the villain when they're summoned and sustained. Get to the root of what they're trying to do and then build around that is one of the things, which is generally probably only Mutants and Masterminds advice. I can't think of other games where that would be an issue, where that would be a solution to the problem, but finding ways to reduce how many other characters you have in the scene is a great technique. Yeah, Paul says that's one of my favorite things about effects first systems. Definitely. Yeah, what other powers come up as a problem a lot of the time for y'all? That's relevant to one of my players who's playing a good guy Necromancer. Yeah. And there's no reason outside of combat that they can't summon the skeleton to roleplay with if that's what they want to do. Which, after playing Veilguard, I want to have a skeleton named Manfred who plays Rock, Paper, Scissors with me. Tempo says, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure certainly shows how powers can be powerful, not in how overpowered they could be, but how the characters use those powers in creative ways. Yeah. David Bodie says mind reading regeneration. Yeah, regeneration can be tough as well. GM Jonesy wet bones the skeleton. My player made his necromancer because of that game. Yeah, well, Emmerich is a good companion. I love Emmerich, and everybody should treat him better. Jonesy brings up that I've mentioned many times that your skeleton is only dry if you're dead, so it's good when your bones are wet. Regeneration is really only a big problem when combined with high toughness. Yeah, and again, let your player know if you're worried about failing a combat encounter leading to the death of your character, eject that idea from your head. That's not the kind of game we're playing. You don't need to be immortal. You don't need to be invincible. You're going to be fine. Even if you lose a scene or you lose an encounter, that's just going to propel the story forward in a different direction. The game we're playing is meant to be fun and easy to deal with. Weaken is mechanically difficult. Weaken is mechanically difficult. Weaken is a power effect I'm hoping to do some work on. We had a character in a game who was a hero who used their power so much that it made the idea of damage almost irrelevant. Yeah. And again, that comes down to the discussion you have with your players about their character concepts. And you have the right to veto things. Don't feel like just because I'm saying that, seeing these problems as powers as a problem is not the right mindset to bring into it. You still have the right to, control the fun of what's going on. Just because, and there is a solution. You have to get to the root of why the player wants to do that, and then, come up with a compromise. Bodhi says, I found it hard to describe how affliction can be used in many different ways to simulate everything from poison to an ice wall. Yeah, that's something, especially in the Valiant edition we have coming out. Steve and I have gone through and pre-built a bunch of afflictions to help with that. We've got toxin and stun and snare and sleep and lots of different things that are pre-built so that there's less discussion about that sort of thing. But we still have affliction as a power, so if you want to build an interesting take on an affliction, you can do that as well. So weaken. You can temporarily lower one of a target's traits. Chosen when this effect is acquired, you must touch the target, making a normal close attack check. Failure. The target loses power points from the affected trait equal to the difference between the check result and the DC, up to a maximum of the weaken rank. Yeah, that's complicated. I can't say much about that, but it is something that we're looking at. Because the PowerPoint, that's the confusing part, is figuring out how many points worth of trait is being stolen up to the maximum of the rank. And how quickly does it come back? The player is getting frustrated because the GM keeps vetoing their powers, but the problem isn't the powers, it's the fact that they keep wanting to steamroll every situation. Yeah. And that comes down to an expectation conversation, framing it as, this is the kind of story I want to tell. Why are you hung up on this? What are you worried about? What can I do to alleviate your concern that, we just want to, it's a standard story. You don't need to be a super broken build to get through it. I'm not going to put you in the Tomb of Horrors or anything like that. And letting them know that there are safety nets especially in mutants and masterminds. You have hero points. There are bennies. You can re-roll dice if you're not doing well. You can get rewarded for getting into a difficult situation and come back more powerful. Devious says, I have a section in my guide on running your first M&M campaign on setting house rules. Yeah. And having that discussion with your players. I mean, I feel like every week we talk about any issue we talk about comes down to a root issue of talk to your players, communicate, set expectations, because it, not doing that can lead to miscommunication. It can lead to frustration. It can lead to people wanting different things from what's going on and nobody being satisfied. And that's what leads to bad games. And you don't want to have a bad game if you can avoid it. I cast Affliction. Perception, ranged affliction, resisted by will, overcome by sleight of hand or damage, transform limited to 3rd degree. Puts an Affliction Dewdrop shirt on targets. Amazing. David Bodie says, explaining what comic age, lowercase, Silver Age, Bronze Age, etc., that you're expecting to run is good to start with. Yeah. And sharing other media. I'm inspired by these kinds of stories. These are the kinds of tropes you can expect. So I like Justice League Unlimited. So I will be pulling some ideas from that. I like The Boys. So expect some social commentary and blood bags. Or I really like Golden Age stories, and I want to go back to World War II and do this fun, military superhero adventure. Or I want to tell a Scooby-Doo story, and I want you guys to investigate. And having this story be investigation heavy, it would be easier for me if you didn't have mind reading or all that stuff. And if you are going to have mind reading, how can we compromise and still add a challenge to your character when this comes up? Can you only do it a certain amount of times a day? Does it require direct eye contact? Do you not get the exact truth? You get what they think is the truth? If you can see the future, can you misinterpret the future? Is that future you're seeing set in stone, or is that just one possible future? Or do your visions come in your dreams and you're an unreliable narrator? Coming up with ways of communicating that. Yeah, in the end, I think having open lines of communication works better than trying to legislate behavior, because then the player takes it as a challenge to be overcome. Yes. And that's, at the end of the day, we're trying to tell a story together. The player should have input in that. But you should be able to set the tone that you're comfortable with, because remember, the GM is supposed to have fun too. Bad guys go splook. Blood bags. Oh, I forgot about affliction powers used to simulate transformation type attacks. You're toast. Yeah, I think often transformation powers, I think what makes them a little less problematic is they so rarely work that when it does work off, it's like, oh, that's awesome. I'm glad that went through, and even the GM is excited about it. Paul says it's like the necromancer thing. Just asking the player, what do you want this power to do, can sometimes result in different builds that are closer to the idea they're after. Yeah. Squire says, has anyone mentioned time travel? No, we haven't mentioned time travel, which is something that comes up in a lot of games. And time travel can be a problem power for both the game master and the players, because anytime time travel is introduced, it suddenly raises a lot of questions that are going to need answers. Questions like, if I go back and change the past, what are the consequences? If I go back and try to change the past, is it possible? Am I really fixing the present, or am I just traveling to a different timeline? One of the things I really like about our Time Travelers Codex is that we try to answer some of these questions in that book. Sort of different modes of how does time travel work? Is it is time a river? Is it endless? Is it a bunch of variant timelines? So it's more like the multiverse than time traveling. What are some time travel tropes? What happens if you wind up in the wrong place? And it's all important because I really like time travel stories mechanically. I really like Legends of Tomorrow, is one of my favorite superhero media ever. And their whole conceit is they're time traveling. But there are rules in place that make it so that there's things they have to consider. Like they can't go to the same point in time twice. They shouldn't run into each other when they're time traveling. That's according to paradoxes. There are creatures who are more powerful than the time travelers who are able to come out and punish them if they make too many bad choices. And one of my favorite mechanics for time traveling is the fixed point in time. There's a fun episode of Legends of Tomorrow where there is it's sort of like a speed run to try to stop Archduke Franz Ferdinand from getting assassinated. But everybody fails who tries it. It's just a test of how long can you last before you fail in your attempt to stop it and what changes. So I think that it would be a really fun adventure to run. I'd have to really think about how to accommodate that, though. Yeah, time loops are fun. But when the players can time travel anytime they want, that sort of gives them endless do-overs, unless there are consequences in place to prevent that. So thinking of what can we change, what can't we change, and even if they're new to time travel, having somebody who can explain the way it works, come on and give the rules, is a good way to let them know that, hey, you can do this, but here are the rails for that thing. Langoliers. Squire says, one of my favorite time travel tropes is you can't change a major thing because the you had no reason to time travel in the first place. One campaign, we had an unwilling time travel character. According to him, he gained his powers from a time machine, which would be invented by my character. Ooh. Well, you see, and that's just drama, because is that true? What is their feeling about this curse you've accidentally put on them? There's so much good meat in there. I made it a point of conflict by having all his experiments continually confounded. There's no reason this shouldn't work. I was sent back in time by an idiot. It's so frustrating. Yeah, and there's things like time travel. There can be chronal dead zones where you can't travel to this time period. You can't travel out of this time period. Finding interesting ways to use that ability, but still make it feel like a tool that isn't a solve everything button. Dr. Void says, I put a temporary ban on time travel powers until and unless it comes up in plot and asks for my players' trust, which they gave. Suckers. Kidding, says Dr. Void. The player was someone who couldn't make every session, so that was a great way to get around it. Yeah, that's great. I really like the theory that Gandalf is a player who couldn't make it to every session, especially in The Hobbit. Yeah, and I think that's also the important thing to keep in mind with these problematic powers is temporary bans are an option. And just let your players know, once I get more comfortable with this, we can talk about adding this element to the story. Just because it never existed before doesn't mean it can't exist going forward, especially things like time travel or magic or aliens, metahumans. Any trope can be incorporated at a later point by some kind of shenanigans. GM Jonesy says requiring skill tests for some of these powers can be helpful. Yeah. Tying its success to a dice roll is a good way to make sure it doesn't feel broken all the time. So we have the check required flaw in Mutants and Masterminds, where you can't even activate your power until you roll a certain amount. David Bodie says time travel could be harder knowing that the solar system is actually moving through space. You might be able to go back in time, but you end up in space where the Earth is or might be. Yeah, I saw a model of what the solar system looks like moving through space, and it gave me some existential dread. Just a little bit. Just because we're not spinning in a circle, we're sort of like firing like a missile that's circling around itself. Yeah, complications can be a good way to deal with it too by offering hero points if the player finds a good reason to not short-circuit the story. Yes. Yeah, and this is the difference between a good player and a player who's just trying to fuck with you, is finding that finding that communication, finding that collaboration. Doc Void says, challenge level scales with my group's understanding of the rules, which I figure is normal, but I'm a newbie. Yeah, it can be tough. But you get to learn things, and you get to unlock new portions of the world as it goes. You see lots of stories do that, even without a game aspect to it. I think that's why the Arrowverse was so successful, is they started with a certain level, and then they added another threshold, and they added more thresholds, and they added more thresholds as everybody got comfortable with the world. And that's a great thing to just keep in mind for all of your stories, whether it's a role-playing game story, a novel. I call this brick wall world building, where every world you introduce somebody to has a learning curve. And the steeper you make that learning curve seem in the beginning, the harder it's going to be for anybody to get invested in the story. So eventually it becomes too steep that it becomes a brick wall and they bounce off of it. And then they get out of your story and they never come back. So finding ways to get people invested in characters and situations and conflicts is going to be a lot better for you than introducing a lot of proper nouns all at once. Or introducing, here's 10 million concepts that you have to do all at once. Paul says, sucking at stuff is the first step towards being awesome at stuff. Jake the dog. Yeah, that show was crazy. It was just every now and then it would just drop a real lifeism at you. And then it would go back to, I make you bake your pancakes. Like, yeah, what other thoughts do we have about problem powers and how to navigate them? Or what other kinds of powers should we chat about? We have about 10 minutes left. And this is mostly from a mechanical perspective. Dimension travel, David Bodie. A lot of the same issues with dimension travel and time travel. Being able to completely step outside of one universe and step back into it is, can lead to a lot of abuse on certain players' side. And it can also lead to, Bodie mentions it could be just the story writer's problem, which is true. The more options you introduce to yourself, the more things you have to account for, and the more opportunities you have to make something feel unsatisfying. So, look for the joy in limitations. So, picking just a handful of dimensions that are close enough that they could travel to, or picking a group of dimensions that are united by some common theme. Or, I'm doing a multiverse story right now, where the villain is traveling between multiverses and trying to get one key item from each universe. So they never have to stay there for very long, so it doesn't have to feel completely lived in, completely in depth. Finding those limitations is going to make life a lot easier for you as the GM when dealing with dimension travel. And I know it's annoying having to write up a cosmology, but if you are going to be including a lot of dimension travel, you want to have a sense of what the neighborhood is for all those dimensions. Is it like the endless Earths, where it's an infinite amount of Earths and everything is possible and nothing matters? Or are there 52 Earths and you get to come up with all 52 of them? Or are there just like 3 dimensions you could travel to because you can only go to adjacent dimensions before things get really weird? And I think that's a core lesson to take from this entire discussion is there is intrigue in limitation, and being able to share that intrigue with your players can lead to better stories. Yes, Bodhi mentions, unless it's the main story, like Rick and Morty. Yeah, where dimension hopping is sort of their whole thing. Yeah, Paul says a tantalizing glimpse of a world where players fill in the gaps for themselves can be far better than the GM doing a comprehensive write-up. Yeah, better for the players, better for you. I'm a big fan of icebergs, where you can see the tip and the tip is interesting, but the player knows that there's more underneath there, and that's all they need to know. They're not going to go look at it. And you have to remember that some world building is just for you as the GM. It can be interesting, it can be exciting, but it's not necessarily information that the players need or want. It's just information that you have that makes running the game easier. I tell that to authors as well, where you are very excited about this world and you love this world, but people who are just getting introduced to your setting are not going to care about every last minute detail. There's a reason wikis exist for people who are interested in those deeper dives. Tempo says Doctor Strange and the Madness of the Multiverse is again good for showing that. Oh yeah, I really like that movie. I do wish we'd seen a couple more dimensions, but I think it's. I'm biased because I like Sam Raimi, but Devious says, for variables, I usually enforce requiring the player to come up with a spell book of things they need to have before use in game that I approve before they show up, like your menagerie of pre-approved characters from the Beast Boy type. Yep. Yeah, a library really, really helps with that. Paul says, players will sometimes speculate on what else could be there, which gives you a fertile field of ideas to steal. Yeah, they did do Wanda a little dirty in that one. I'm hoping that we are going to see her again and that she'll get a chance. So just to sort of summarize, finding interesting limitations for these problem powers, framing them not as problems in your own mind, but as an insight into what the player is thinking about the campaign, and asking, facilitating conversation with why are they interested in this? What can we do to accommodate your needs and my needs? Yeah, I like that movie, but it was so easy to solve. And I know like the Darkhold or whatever is evil, but it was literally a 2-second thought experiment to be like, what if I asked America Chavez to take me to a multiverse where my kids just lost their mom and then I can just step in and be their mom? There was no reason for all that violence and nonsense. Bodhi says not necessarily difficult powers, but having players that want to play iconic comic characters can be distressing. Yeah, let's talk about that. Having, and we juggle this a little bit. I know they're not as iconic as like a DC or a Marvel superhero, but we do juggle this a little bit in Freedomly Dark, where a couple of the player characters are canon Earth Prime characters. Bowman is one of the main characters. Centuria is one of the main characters, and that can be distressing for the GM or the player playing them. I think it's important to have a conversation up front with that person that this is an Elseworld story. This has its own continuity. There's no plot armor for a character that is iconic, and feel free when you are playing this character to play them how you want, because this is your version of the character. I don't have any expectations. I don't have any expectations about, how you're going to play this character. I don't have any expectations about how they're going to interact with the story. And the fact that you are introducing this iconic character also implies that there are going to be some iconic NPCs and iconic villains that I'm going to have to take on the role of. So please understand, together, this is not the prime version of that character. I think one of the things that both Bowman and Centuria do really well in my game is they play the character the way that they want to. They don't worry about the weight of, this is how it happens in prime continuity. Centuria even went so far as to basically be her own character, her own version of Centuria from another dimension, different from the prime Centuria, who's also from a different dimension. But we found a way to incorporate that character concept especially with our Nether War game, where that Centuria had survived a Nether War, so she had expertise in Nether War to occasionally know what was going to happen or what the villain's plan was in a given scene. So she could make a skill check, and if that skill check was high enough, she got a little bit of insight into what's going on. Poor Wanda didn't get off the hook so easy like Kerrigan and Sylvanas did. Yeah. That's why I always start world building with the player characters. So the stuff I'm building is stuff that can immediately be invested in. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of, here's a list of things I need. A corrupt business is going to feature in this story. Do any of you want to have a corrupt business in your backstory? Or I have an idea for a retired superhero who I want to be involved in the narrative. Are any of you interested in being their sidekick, or maybe they're the person taking up their mantle? Looking for little places that I don't put a lot of detail in that are specifically meant for players too. So if they're interested, they'll grab onto that and they can deal with it. Warren Maximus, is that the Velcro cape principle? I'm just saying all of those murders around Edna Mode's head because Velcro exists. Red Skull her redemption arc before Wanda did. Yeah, so Calvin, who plays Bowman in my game, says, I tried to lean into a different direction from Canon Bowman when I started. It took a bit of time, but eventually felt more like I was playing my own character than misinterpreting someone else's. Yeah, it's hard. It can be daunting at first. And the idea is, am I playing a campaign? Am I playing a one-shot? Am I at a convention? If I'm stepping into an iconic character, is that, what are the expectations I should have about playing this character? I play Superman all the time in convention games and in one-shots, and I love playing Superman, and I just have a way that I play him anywhere. They did Spider-Man dirty, same way in the comics. Jonesy says, I love legacy characters. Deuce, hey Deuce. Womanizer Bowman instead of Prime Bowman. Oh, look, poor Bowman just doesn't make good choices about women. Yeah, Doc, you should come and watch Nether War. I'm really proud of the work we did. And I'm proud of the work we do in Freedom We Dark in the Multiverse of the Master Mage, which is our follow-up. Played a con game where everybody played a Robin, and I really enjoyed really leaning into as many elements of Dick Grayson as a character as I could. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably enough for this topic for today. If you have any more, please feel free to leave comments. I do come back and check the videos a week or two after the videos go out, just to check on comments. Like the video, subscribe, tell your friends about us so that you come back and see what we're doing. Next Tuesday, we'll be diving into another awesome topic, which is it's creating memorable NPCs. So we're gonna have a great time with that. Yeah, so please write down questions if you have them. Send them over to me on the Atomic Think Tank if you need. So yeah, through the end of the year, the 17th, we have making memorable NPCs, and then we're off on Christmas Eve because duh. And we'll be back on the 31st for Game Master Resolution. So be thinking about what sort of things you want to do in the new year as a GM so we can all discuss them together. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bodhi. I appreciate it. Vibes are important. I say this at the end of every episode, but creating new GMs is one of the most important things to making our hobby grow and flourish. It's one of the most important jobs that you can do in tabletop role-playing gaming, and I think everybody should try it at least once. It's not as scary as it looks, and I promise there are so many people rooting for you. Yeah. Thank you all for the discussion. Thank you all for the stream. Thursday, I think we have Thursdays. Let me double check. Only Troy knows. Here we go. Yes, Thursday we do have a Thursdayge. Tomorrow we have the M&M mix-up, and then next Monday we have dealing with speedsters for Mutants and Masterminds Monday. So keep in. Next week is also our dev chat and our workshop. So if you're interested in learning some game design stuff, joining the Atomic Think Tank is a great opportunity because we're currently building a role-playing game book called The Pinewood Project, which is very close to my heart. It's about small town superheroing. We're all creating a small town. We're creating rules for how to incorporate those kinds of stories. So join in if you want to get involved in that. We still have writing to assign, so let me know. And yeah, that's it for me. I hope you have a great rest of your day and take some time to play a game yourself. Oh, Dr. Void, I'll go check. I might have missed it, but I'll go check. I'll see you all next time.